Good morning, it's 8:30. The Community Voice program brought to us by Tanner Health System, and I'll be hosting the program today. Adam Uglum, yours truly, the morning news host, here Monday through Friday from 6 to 8:30, with a couple of days a week for your political insight. Those days this week, Tuesday and Wednesday, usually Tuesday and Thursday, but this week, Tuesday and Wednesday. So stay tuned for tomorrow's program if you are a regular listener, or if you're interested in listening to me again, if you're a new listener today. Whatever your exigencies may be. So today is Super Tuesday, and I'm actually going to, because I think it's such a good article, I don't like reading stuff on the air too much, but Thomas Sowell is a very good writer, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen him appear in the Times-Georgian, if you read the Times-Georgian, and some of you may or may not know he is a libertarian, as a lot of the very famous journalists, or not journalists, are syndicated columnists. You'd be surprised how many libertarians there are. I think you really would. There's a lot of people in the Republican Party who consider themselves libertarians. I mean, I think it's a good 20-30%, depending on who you ask. But anyway, this is Thomas Sowell. Many people are looking to the mini primary elections today to clarify where this year's Republican nomination campaign is headed. It may clarify far more than that, including the future of this nation and of Western civilization. If a clear winner with a commanding lead emerges, the question then becomes whether that candidate is someone who is likely to defeat Barack Obama. If not, then the fate of America and of Western nations, including Israel, will be left in the hands of a man with a lifelong hostility to Western values and Western interests. President Obama is such a genial man that many people across the ideological space can't see him as a danger. For every 100 people who can see his geniality, probably only a handful see the grave danger of his warped policies and ruthless tactics posed to a whole way of life that has given generation after generation of Americans unprecedented freedom and prosperity. The election next November will not just be another election, and the stakes add up to far more than the sum of the individual issues. Moreover, if reelected and facing no future election, whatever political constraints may have limited how far Obama would push his radical agenda will be gone. He would have the closest thing to a blank check. Nothing could stop him but impeachment or a military coup, and both are very unlikely. A genial corrupter is all the more dangerous for being genial. The four remaining Republican candidates have to be judged not simply by whether they would make good presidents, but by how well they can cut through Obama's personal popularity and glib rhetoric to alert the voters as to the stakes in this year's election. There's a good bit left in the column. I won't read it all to you, but that's the basic gist of it. Whether you like the Republican candidates or not, there's a lot more to lose when it comes to this election. Every budget that has existed under this president has been a deficit of over $1 trillion. The worst deficit President Bush had was $400 billion. And that was under a Democratic Congress. I think his worst under a Republican Congress was $200 billion, which is still a lot. But it's not $1 trillion 4 years in a row. This is why so many people are waking up and paying attention, is because they realize that these are awfully big numbers that we're dealing with. When we're talking about trillions of dollars of national debt, that's one thing. But we're talking about a budget deficit of $1 trillion in 1 year. People say, hey, now, wait a minute. It took us a long time to get $8 trillion in debt. Now we're at $15 trillion in 5 years, 6 years. When Democrats took control of Congress, I think the debt was just shy of $8 trillion. They've been controlling the purse strings for going on 6 years now, and we've doubled the national debt in that time. Now, I'm not going to say Republicans are fiscal hawks, but my goodness, the last 6 years of Democrat regime in Washington has been very much unlike Democrat control in previous years. It's been crazy. To kind of get onto this libertarian aspect of this, I want to give you a few examples of how the federal government has simply become too big in the United States. The Department of Agriculture's Value-Added Marketing Grant Program which is a relatively very small slice of corporate welfare, is going to hand out $56 million in taxpayer dollars this year to producers of agricultural commodities who can use the money for planning activities, quote, and for working capital for marketing value-added agricultural products. Here are the big winners this year. They appear to be wine producers. $33,000 for the Outer Coastal Plain Vineyards Association in New Jersey. That's the median income of an individual in the country. $33,000. They get better. $50,000 for the Ozan Vineyard and Cellar in Alabama. $94 for the Wild Vines Winery in Oregon, plus $23,000 for the Southern Oregon Winery Association. $50,000 for the Feather River Vineyards in Nebraska. The USDA kindly kicked in another $50,000 for Nebraska's Knotted Wood Distillery to help them market their whiskey. 3 wineries in New York received $300,000 combined. The wine grants were complemented quite nicely with about a $120,000 grant given to a New York cheesemaker. You've got to be kidding me. Why on earth are we spending $56 million in taxpayer money to give to agricultural producers to advertise? Now, $56 million is a pretty small outlay in a $3.8 trillion federal budget. The point here is not so much the size of the program or the cost. It's more that the program symbolizes the problem with Washington, D.C. by allowing the government to spend other people's money on virtually anything that the politicians on Capitol Hill desire. So one thing this leads me to tell you before we go to the break is a golden rule that Dan Mitchell has come up with. It's Dan Mitchell's golden rule, he calls it. And I like it. I discovered it this morning. He calls it, the private sector should grow faster than the government. Very simple. I like it. And here's a quote from Frederick Bastiat, an economist, an old one. Everyone wants to live at the expense of the state. They forget that the state lives at the expense of everyone. Back after this. We are back. Okay, so if we do a little digging, and this is something that political science and economics people do, is dig through research. It was a couple of weeks ago. I forget exactly where I found the data, but it's a combination of Gallup polls and other well-respected national polls. And with regards to libertarianism, it's awfully surprising how much of the country considers themselves libertarian when conducted in a national poll. About 30% of the country considers themselves libertarian. Now, as far as voter registration, that's a little different because we have to understand that we have a dual plurality system where the winner takes all. It's a system designed to butt out third parties. So the Libertarian Party, quite frankly, is never going to have a whole lot of success in the country unless one of the two major parties somehow implodes. That's the only way that one party supplants another, is that if they seriously have political implosion. So there are right libertarians and there are left libertarians. Now, most of the Republican factions of libertarians are libertarians because of likely Ronald Reagan, I would have to guess. Most of anybody older than me does remember Reagan at least a little bit. I was born in 1988, so if you're closer to 30 and older, you do remember Reagan at least somewhat, or the impacts thereof. And the 80s was a good time from the people I've spoken to about the 1980s. And we do have a phone call on line 2. So we're going to go right to the phones before I get into what I'd like to talk about next. Good morning. You are on the Community Voice program. Hello.
Good morning, Adam. How are you this morning, sir?
I'm doing just fine. What can I do for you?
Real quickly, I just wanted to dovetail on something that you had said, a number of things you're talking about this morning. And I picked up a book the other day at Horton's bookstore. Shameless plug for him. In any event, it's called How Do You Kill 11 Million People? And it sounds like a strange book, but it's a little tiny read, but it talks about, and I think it hits on today's society, a great deal on both sides of the aisle, and it talks about how people become subjugated, basically, by the government. And the biggest way they do that is by lying. And like I said, it goes on both sides of the aisle. So I recommend anybody that considers themselves informed politically, or anybody else, to pick this little book up and have a quick read. Again, Adam, you're such a studious guy. It'd take you about an hour to read it, I think.
What's the book called?
It's called How Do You Kill 11 Million People by Andy Andrews. But it's very compelling, very interesting. Talks about how societies have come and gone in history and why they've come and gone in history. And I'm concerned, as I think you are, that our society is heading down that same path as so many have before. And this really puts it into perspective for folks, and I highly recommend it. I'll go online and get it, put it on your Kindle, what have you, and read it at lunchtime.
All right, well, I appreciate the phone call.
You bet. Take care. Thanks for the show.
Absolutely. And if anyone else would like to call in, the number is 678-601-8255. That's 678-601-TALK if you'd like to call and be part of the program. I often do forget to give the number out. But back to where I'd left off, I do appreciate the phone call, and that sounds like an interesting book. I will be honest and say I have about 17 textbooks this semester. This semester is going to ruin me. If I survive this one, I'll be okay. But anyway, so getting back to this whole left-right thing within the libertarian spectrum and how the Republican Party is becoming more and more libertarian, there's a lot of discussion, it seems to me, in the political back and forth that the national parties have become far too polarized, and this is a bad thing. We need to come together and work together. And what that always reminds me of is a quote from Ayn Rand. Love or hate Ayn Rand. I think she's spot on a lot of things. I don't think objectivism is a very solid philosophy. There are many people who might disagree with me. I do like objectivism. I think it has practical uses. But this is one of my favorite quotes from Ayn Rand. She says, "In any compromise between food and poison, it is only death that can win. In any compromise between good and evil, it is only evil that can profit." And to me, that goes across a whole spectrum of things, and a lot of that is the compromise between more government and less government. So anyway, there's a column in the Washington Examiner written by Tim Carney I'd like to read an excerpt from as well. His column is largely about Rick Santorum's inability to unite proponents of limited government, but that's secondary to the very insightful analysis that he provides on how conservatives and libertarians can be natural allies. The divide between libertarianism and the social conservatives could really be gapped, or be bridged, excuse me. That gap can be bridged is a good way to put that, I suppose. And here's what he says from in the first passage I'd like to read to you anyway. For many of today's liberals, if something is bad, like the traditional light bulb, a very high health insurance deductible, a gas-guzzling car, or a lack of racial diversity, the government ought to outlaw it. Maybe they can't comprehend the mindset of many of today's conservatives who revere both individual liberty and traditional morality as the necessary conditions for human happiness, and thus say that certain behaviors are immoral but shouldn't be illegal. Not only are traditional morality and limited government totally compatible, today they are intimately linked, as the left uses big government to subsidize abortion providers and force all employers to pay for their employees' contraceptives. The moral law should guide our personal actions, and individual liberty should guide our political decisions. When the left cries that conservatives are trying to legislate morality, that's typically projection and misdirection from the left's attempts to legislate morality. They say we're trying to outlaw buying contraception. More often than not in the United States these days, it's the secular left that is imposing its morality on the religious right. If you don't want to photograph a gay wedding, you're fine. If you don't want to sell the morning after pill at your pharmacy, you're driven out of work. If you don't want to pay for your employees' sterilization, you're a criminal. If you don't want to subsidize Planned Parenthood with your tax dollars, too bad, pay up. An alliance between libertarians and conservatives is natural and right today. The proper conservative response is to fight for the liberty of all Americans, including religious conservatives, to manage their own affairs according to what they believe is correct. Increasing the size of government, even in the name of a more moral society, simply gives the left more weapons to turn on the right in the culture war. Obamacare is the perfect example. So I want to recall a couple of points where I remember with the presidential candidates that were very good lines. And this would have helped Rick Santorum from the very beginning if he had stuck to this line, which came out in a debate, 3 weeks ago. And to paraphrase, it was something along the lines of, I may talk a lot about social morality, how important family is, how I'm against contraceptives and things like that, but it doesn't mean I want a government program to fix it. That is the difference between Rick Santorum and the left. While he wants to uphold his moral high ground, he wants to open the conversation, not create a government program or a law to solve that problem. The whole idea, and how the left is painting Rick Santorum as this eventual theocracy that will bestow itself upon the United States if he is elected president, is intellectually dishonest, in my opinion. I think it's completely wrong to allege that somehow we're going to all of a sudden, just by electing one person to the administrative office in the country, that we're going to have this theocracy in the United States. It's beyond ridiculous. Now, I may completely disagree with Rick Santorum on a lot of issues, and I do. I've criticized him on my program in months prior. I've gone through a long list of votes he made in the Senate that I very much disagree with. But the idea that he's going to create a theocracy is not a good way to have an intelligent discussion about a potential presidential nomination. But the column I just read to you probably makes sense to me because I'm somewhat of a social conservative in my personal life. I've never smoked. I've never done drugs. I don't gamble much at all. I've done it before, but it's not something that is alluring to me. I rarely drink, and I certainly don't deal with prostitutes other than the non-sexual ones serving in government. I also have a pretty traditional view on the importance of family, but I've never thought that my boring personal preferences should be part of the law. And this points me to one thing that I remember Ron Paul saying that I thought was very good. They were talking about the very contentious issue of abortion, contraception, government's role in legislating morality. And Ron Paul says, look, you know what? Whatever you do, changing the law does not fix the morality. If you fix the morality, the law doesn't matter. In your campaign against abortion, you pro-lifers out there, myself included, if you can have an impact on the world as to reduce the number of abortions as opposed to repealing Roe versus Wade and it becoming a state issue, which would be a good thing. The federal government has no position at the national level to make the decision like it did in Roe versus Wade, setting the precedent for abortion to be legal in all 50 states. That is a state issue. I would much rather a lot of what we're dealing with at the national level be state issues like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, etc. But that's a topic for another day. We'll talk about federalism on another program. My complicated theories about making government smaller by giving all of those federal powers to state powers. We'll have a lot more direct control over them. But back after the break, we'll talk about one more thing before we close the program. Hard to believe it's already 8:50. If you have a comment or you have a question, criticism, please feel free to give me a phone call. The number is 678-601-8255. Again, the number is 678-601-8255. And if you'd like to leave me an email, comment as well, as many of my listeners do, the email address is libertariats@gmail.com. If you speak it out, it's spelled like it's spoken. Libertariats@gmail.com. Back after the break. We are back with about 7 minutes left in the program. In my opinion, good fiscal policy exists when the private sector, the individuals, when they grow faster than the public sector. While fiscal ruin is inevitable if government spending grows faster than the productive part of the economy. We're actually discussing art, oddly enough, in my senior seminar class yesterday, talking about how art is crucial, as Alexis de Tocqueville would argue in his Democracy in America text, that art is crucial to having a successful democracy. He notes in his experiences in America, and I think Tocqueville came to America a little early. Arts hadn't quite gotten anywhere in America, but shortly thereafter, his departure from America, arts really took off. American literature is very good in the late 1800s. So I proposed a question to the class. One student made the argument that, American art may not have an American identity. It's not like European art. It's wholly different. It's not unique or special like anywhere else. Another student in the class took a very big point of disagreement on that. And I thought for a second, I said, you know what? If art is so crucial to the success of a future people, why is it that Europe, with all of its art, is a fiscal basket case when it comes to economic and government policy? I mean, if art, as Tocqueville would say, is crucial to the success of a nation, why is it that these artistic countries like Greece, Italy, the United Kingdom, France, why is it that they are fiscal basket cases? Spain, Portugal, just to name a few more. I'm not too familiar with German art. Maybe that's why Germany's actually doing pretty well fiscally. I don't know. But it was just a thought that came across my mind. And if we're going to say that Americans don't have this artistic nature, and that's a bad thing, well, how do we empirically prove that? Because America, at least yet, is not as bad off as most of Europe is. And they have the art. So I thought it was kind of interesting to say that, well, we're doomed because we don't have arts like Europe does. But Europe is already doomed, and we're still salvageable. As I've mentioned many times before in the program, we can still fix this. It's just a matter of being willing to fix it. We've known these problems that we have today have been coming since the 1980s. We knew in the 1980s that Social Security was largely going to be absolutely broken in 30 years, 40 years. We know that today, that Medicare is going to be broken in 5 years if we don't do something to fix it. Crunch time is coming, and something's got to be done soon. The sooner the better. It's less painful the sooner we deal with it, and a lot more painful the later we deal with these problems. However they're fixed, they got to be fixed somehow. Taxes are going to have to go up. Spending's going to have to be decreased. A combination of both, one or the other. We're going to have to decide because the math is there, whether you look at the Congressional Budget Office, whether or not you look. And the Congressional Budget Office is honestly very optimistic, which is a bad thing because they tell us that the problem won't be here for another 12 or 15 years. Lo and behold, it's here in 6, as has happened in the past. The Congressional Budget Office has a very poor track record at projections. And it's designed to have a very poor track record. I spoke about this on one of my shows last week about how the Congressional Budget Office is designed to make Washington look good. So it's a very good resource for 1 or 2 year projections and especially historical data, as it's a bipartisan commission. But it's also a bipartisan commission designed to make both the right and the left look good. It does also inherently have issues with tax cuts, the Congressional Budget Office, because it assumes that if you cut taxes, the economy won't grow. It assumes that if you cut taxes, behavior won't change. It assumes that if you raise taxes, the economy won't shrink. It assumes if you raise taxes, behavior won't change. So there are a lot of problems with the Congressional Budget Office, and in the world of economics, we call this static budgeting, static modeling, where you assume that the way things are today are going to be the same thing tomorrow. So when you do this, you make a lot of very dangerous assumptions about your projections, which largely leads to the Congressional Budget Office being very wrong on a very big number of things. There were a couple of points I wanted to touch on today, but it doesn't look like we're going to make it to them. So you have to tune in tomorrow for the Community Voice program right here on News Talk 1330. I'll be here tomorrow in the same seat as well at 8:30 for the Community Voice program. I will leave you with this. The problem that we have today, as far as money goes, why we talk about money so much, I'm not sure, but it bothers most people more than anything else, so I think that's why it's a popular topic. For example, urging Congress to spend more money on infrastructure. You've got to get past this mentality that you can't spend any money at all, according to a big government people. Because it's that kind of attitude that's given us a federal budget of $3.8 trillion, up more than 100% in 10 years. Government spending as outlays at 2009 levels were 24%. In the same year, government receipts were 16%, an 8% difference. That's where we get to where we are today. Now, the gap is closing in recent years. Outlays are still very high and projected to go higher. Fortunately, receipts are coming back as we have a very timid recovery. The recovery is not sharp. If you look at recoveries from the recession in 2001 and the recession in 1980, and look at those two economic recoveries, economic growth was much faster in those first 12 or 15 months of both of those presidencies. The track record for Obama's economic policies is not very good. It's not awful, but he clearly didn't look at a history book and see what worked best as far as getting the economy moving again. We'll talk about the myth of oil subsidies tomorrow, so if that's something that interests you, be sure to tune in right here on News Talk 1330 tomorrow at 8:30. I'll be hosting the program one more time this week. By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe. Libertariat@gmail.com, libertariat.wordpress.com. For more, stay tuned. National headlines are next.